An energy truce has been declared in Russia's war with Ukraine, for now. The President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, publicly stated that he personally asked Vladimir Putin to stop shelling Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities. Exactly for 1 week due to extreme cold, and Vladimir Putin, according to the American president, agreed to do it.
Personally asked President Putin not to fire into Kyiv and the various towns for a week, and he agreed to do that, and I have to tell you, it was very nice. Many people said not to waste the coal because it wouldn't work, but he did it, and we're glad he did.
At the same time, there had long been rumors that the delegations in Abu Dhabi were actually discussing an energy truce. Well, this morning, Russian war correspondents hysterically claimed that Putin betrayed everyone and actually agreed not to strike at Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Although later, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov refused to comment on this. At the same time, Ukrainian officials say they learned about the ceasefire from Donald Trump's statement and did not receive any signal from the Russian Federation. Therefore, they are not yet sure that a truce has actually been reached. At the same time, the Russians have once again started working on Donald Trump and his wife, Melania Trump. The First Lady of the United States said that Vladimir Putin personally promised her to generously release some of the Ukrainian children who had been captured and deported to Russia. As expected, the Russians quickly began manipulating the situation right after. The head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, rejected the agreements reached by the United States and its allies on security guarantees for Ukraine, stating that they are aimed at preserving the Russophobic regime and turning Ukraine into a staging ground for creating threats to the Russian Federation. So much for all the negotiations, but still, let's discuss what's true here and what's manipulation. My name is Pechiy, and we'll discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this video, leave any comment under this episode, and subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechiy News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. So, the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, said that he personally appealed to Vladimir Putin with a request to stop the shelling of Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities. Exactly for 1 week due to extreme cold. And Vladimir Putin, according to Trump, agreed to do this further. Quote from the American president: "I personally asked Putin not to fire on Kyiv and various cities for a week. He agreed, but in fact, Trump did not mention when the ceasefire would begin. Trump called such a step by Putin very nice, and noted that he called Moscow despite the advice of his closest circle, who doubted the advisability of such contacts with the Russian dictator."
And I personally asked President Putin not to fire on Kyiv and various cities for a week, and he agreed to do it. I have to say it was very nice. Many people said not to try and that he wouldn't succeed, but he did, and we're very happy they did.
Right after, Financial Times journalist Christopher Miller, citing Ukrainian officials, said Ukrainian authorities learned about the ceasefire from Donald Trump's statement, which you just heard, and did not receive any signal from the Russian Federation. According to him, they are not yet sure that a ceasefire has actually been reached. Since early morning on January 29, Russian and Ukrainian military correspondents have reported receiving information. Both the armed forces of Ukraine and the armed forces of the Russian Federation have been ordered to stop strikes on energy infrastructure. In particular, Russian Z-bloggers wrote that starting from 7 a.m. on January 29, the armed forces of the Russian Federation have been prohibited from striking any infrastructure facilities throughout Ukraine, including Kyiv and the region, until February 3. Ukrainian military correspondents also wrote that Ukrainian military personnel received a similar order not to strike energy infrastructure facilities in the Russian Federation. And now both sides claim that they agreed on a temporary moratorium during negotiations in Abu Dhabi, but so far only Donald Trump has officially spoken about it. Therefore, there is no final agreement made public yet, and the shelling could indeed resume. Neither Kyiv nor Moscow has officially confirmed this point. The only thing is that the press secretary of the Russian president, Dmitry Peskov, simply refused to comment on the report about the energy truce and just said no comment at all. Nevertheless, according to the Financial Times, the possibility of such a truce was discussed at trilateral talks involving the United States in Abu Dhabi on January 23 and 24. The discussion was about stopping strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure in exchange for Kiev agreeing to halt attacks on Russian oil facilities and tankers. Let me remind you, in December 2025, Volodymyr Zelensky had already proposed a similar agreement, but the Kremlin refused, stating that it was seeking a long-term peace, not temporary measures. Well, if it turns out now that such a truce has indeed been reached, then, well, Russians should really think about the fact that their leadership is constantly deceiving them. Because they were saying that under no circumstances should there be any such truces, because we demand a long-term peace. And now suddenly they agree to it, just like that. In addition, let me remind you that in the spring of 2025, after the talks between Trump and Putin, there was already a 30-day moratorium on strikes against the energy sector, which was later violated by the Russian side. But it's important to remember that the armed forces of Ukraine are actively destroying oil refineries, even oil extraction sites, plus Vladimir Putin's oil tankers. That's why the Russians needed a respite too. But unfortunately, such a truce could turn out to be a big trap, because right now Putin is once again trying to charm Donald Trump and his wife Melania. Let me explain what I mean. First, that is, Donald Trump has already come under influence. Today, Trump said directly that all his advisors told him not to call the Russian dictator, but he believed Putin, not his advisors, and called him anyway. And, you see, he negotiated an energy truce, and unfortunately, we've already been through this, when Trump trusted Putin more than... American intelligence sets a dangerous precedent, but that's not all. Putin is also trying to appease Trump through other means. The First Lady of the United States, Melania Trump, said today that dictator Putin responded to her letter, which was about the reunification of Ukrainian children who were abducted by Russians with their parents. In addition, she said that her representative is currently maintaining constant contact with the Russian side on this issue. And in general, Putin allegedly graciously agreed to release some of the Ukrainian children whom he himself had captured. Let me remind you, the removal of children from Ukraine after the start of Russia's full-scale war against our country became one of the reasons why the International Criminal Court in The Hague issued an arrest warrant for the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. Officially, since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the occupiers have forcibly, I emphasize, forcibly taken almost 20,000 children out of Ukraine. And while Donald Trump and Melania Trump are saying how nice Vladimir Putin is, the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrentiev, rejected the agreements reached by the United States and their allies on security guarantees for Ukraine, stating that they are aimed at, quote, maintaining the Russophobic regime in Kiev and turning Ukraine into a springboard for creating threats to the Russian Federation. And now I will quote Lavrov verbatim. We don't know what guarantees they agreed on, but apparently they protect the same Ukrainian regime which follows a Russophobic neo-Nazi policy. If the goal is to preserve this regime on some part of Ukraine's territory and use it as a springboard against Russia, then such guarantees are unlikely to ensure reliable peace. Yes, Russia is essentially rejecting the security guarantees for Ukraine that have already been developed by the United States and its allies, and is in fact demanding the overthrow of the government in Kyiv. They say this regime shouldn't remain anywhere in Ukraine. In addition, Lavrov stated that back in April 2022, a draft of the guarantees was agreed upon in Istanbul, which should serve as the basis. Today, these are the very guarantees where Russia is also a guarantor of Ukraine's security, and can even block the decisions of the Western coalition. In addition, Russian presidential aide Yuri Ushakov also stated that no one agreed on security guarantees with the Russian side, and therefore they do not agree to them. And here I would like to note that just yesterday, United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio publicly stated that the United States of America and their European allies have reached a general agreement on security guarantees for Ukraine. According to him, these guarantees provide for the deployment of a limited contingent of European troops in Ukraine, mainly French, and British, as well as American support. In addition, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, previously reported that the document on security guarantees from the United States of America is 100% ready. And now the Russians come out and say, we do not accept this. And in fact, the Kremlin is playing another round of its cunning game, which unfortunately Donald Trump is falling for. On one hand, they take steps after which Trump calls Putin nice, and at the same time, on the other hand, they undermine the entire negotiation process. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. Friends, if you found this episode useful and interesting, you can support the work of this YouTube channel with your donation or subscription through the links and details in the description of this video. I would appreciate any support from you. That's all for now. Take care and goodbye, everyone.